Perfect. I'm sorry to begin with him, but this is, of course, where it starts, in a sense, 1933. This is actually 1935, and it's in the heart of Nuremberg, which becomes a spiritual center and, of course, the Nazi Party meeting city every September. One of the grand conceits of the madness of the Nazis was that they were the Third Reich, descended from the First Reich, the Holy Roman Empire. The Second Reich was Bismarck. And the Holy Roman Empire used Nuremberg as a castle city. So the symbolic association and gathering there was one of the reasons they picked it for the rallies. And this is Dachau, not too far south of Nuremberg. In 1933, a former military barracks and prison converted into a concentration camp, not yet a gruesome torture and murder facility, but a detention facility for enemies of the Reich. And this is a Nuremberg Party rally. And you begin to see the numbers and the fervor and the madness that is assembling there. And this is a eugenicist chart that's part of the Nuremberg laws promulgated in 1935, showing how the Nazis determine who is a Jew. We look up and figure out what we think your grandparents were, and then the laws kick in and deprive you of property and bar you from possessions and professions and say you're no longer a citizen of your homeland, etc. And this, by 1939, is the war. These are Nazi tanks rolling into Poland. They look kind of modest by our military standards, but those are horribly destructive weapons, and you know the story. In less than 3 weeks, Poland is defeated and captured by the Germans from the west and from the east by the Russians, their ally. And this is, of course, a haunting, haunting photo of a small boy in Warsaw, whose name we'll never know, whose fate we never know, but can pretty much conclude was a death in these years of occupation and just extreme brutality. This is a photo that was in an album that was preserved by a Nazi officer celebrating the great military conquest of Poland that then became an exhibit at the Nuremberg trial. The Nuremberg trial is a four-nation international undertaking that begins in the fall of 1945. This is 2 years earlier and really the formal start of the road to Nuremberg. This is the Moscow Conference, where the foreign ministers, Molotov and Cordell Hull and Anthony Eden, meet for war planning and post-war planning. Because by 1943, after a perilous year plus, it's now clear that this alliance, of course Russia has switched sides because Hitler attacks it in 41, this alliance will win the war. And in this Moscow meeting, they plan and issue, in a high level of generality, a declaration that we will hold the Nazi perpetrators accountable for starting this war. This will be not just an international alliance that wins militarily, but that then post-war, post-victory, pursues accountability internationally. And from that commitment and then years of additional fighting comes reiteration. This is Yalta in February of 1945. You see the haggard, soon-to-perish President Roosevelt and Stalin and Churchill, and the Yalta Declaration, again, below territorial and post-war occupation issues, includes a discussion of this accountability process at a high level of generality. And then soon Roosevelt is gone, and soon victory is about to be won, and the man on the left inherits the presidency and enormous responsibilities and commitments that he's unprepared for, including somewhere below the Manhattan Project, this international commitment that we will capture Hitler and his inner circle of henchmen who started this war, and we will hold them accountable. And now they're starting to use the word trial. And so Harry Truman reaches across town to a sitting U.S. Supreme Court Justice, Robert H. Jackson. He had been appointed to the court by Roosevelt. He had been a Roosevelt inner circle New Dealer since 1934 when he joined the New Deal. And he was appointed by Roosevelt and confirmed by the Senate to 5 offices: a Treasury Department office, then Assistant Attorney General, then the Solicitor General of the United States, then the Attorney General of the United States, and then at age 49 in 1941, an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. And if different breaks had occurred, and frankly, if there had been a world of peace rather than war, Franklin Roosevelt might have retired after 2 terms, and Robert Jackson might well have been the standard bearer for the New Dealers in 1940 and a future president of the United States. But he was a lawman, and he becomes a justice, and he becomes, in his first 4 years on the court, a very renowned justice. This is just a glimpse of his prominence in 1935. This is the court he begins to argue before. This is the court with Louis Brandeis and with Cardozo in the back row left, Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes. This is Jackson being appointed to the court in 41, and that's Jackson in his robes. But even at age 53, and during the war years, he's not really settled into these robes very happily. His nation is in a world war, and he's in a kind of backwater. He asks Roosevelt to find somebody else for the court and volunteers to come into the executive branch. Roosevelt tells him, stay put. You're frankly not much of a soldier or a military man. And in the end, I intend to make you Chief Justice, but there may be things you're uniquely suited to do after the war, which of course Roosevelt doesn't live to see, but Harry Truman does. And so, recruited in late April, at a time when Hitler is alive, and the war is ongoing but soon to be over, and publicly unveiled on May 2nd, just a few days later, but Hitler is now dead, and so is Himmler, and soon others of the inner circle will be, leaving really only Hermann Goering of the initial inner circle concept. Jackson is publicly unveiled as the American Chief of Counsel for the prosecution of Axis war crimes in the European theater. How's that for a mouthful? It's a big move by the United States to appoint this, sort of biggest law figure in the United States, Justice Jackson, to be our representative, and really an incentive for Britain and the USSR and France to comparably commit talent. Jackson begins to get prepared on U.S. soil, and he meets with components of the government, War Department and State Department and Justice Department. He begins to build a team. He comes to New York with FBI officials and begins to consult with people up here. And in June, down at Foley Square, the FBI was then in the courthouse building, he has a meeting with American Jewish leaders. This man, Jacob Robinson, is a lawyer. He's one of the leading officials of the World Jewish Congress. And in June of 1945, the Jewish leaders meet with Jackson to say, you must know what's happened to the Jews of Europe. Almost 6 million have been exterminated. Now, Robert Jackson, at the heart of the inner circles of Washington, is flabbergasted, which I think is both a bit incriminating of him, but also a bit revealing of the knowing but not knowing and comprehending but not getting it fully that is the official Washington of the war years. Jackson says to Robinson and his colleagues, what's that number based on? And they tell him it's mathematics. Before the war, the census data across the nations of Europe show this many Jews. And now, with normal birth and death rates factored in, the census data from displaced person camps show this many Jews. And the missing increment is the almost 6 million number. And Jackson says, well, that's a basis, obviously, to investigate and to believe horror has happened. And we know of camps, and we know of death, and we know of suffering and torture. But this must be proven. You can't sort of go into trial with an assertion. You need evidence. From this moment in June to 6 months later, when Jackson opens the Nuremberg trial, a furious evidence-gathering process across Europe finds Nazi documents, finds survivors, finds records, builds a case that is about waging war and the horrible consequences, including the suffering of the European Jews and the systematic effort to exterminate them that Robinson and his colleagues had first alleged was such an enormous real thing. Now, this is what Germany looked like. It actually didn't exist. It was divided into Allied sectors and occupied. The American sector is in the blue, and Nuremberg, north of Munich, is in the center of that. The reason why the Nuremberg trial happens in Nuremberg was not the associations of Nazi rallies and Nuremberg laws, although that is a nice additional reason. It's because it was in the American zone, and it could be controlled and provisioned and secured by the Americans. But first they had to work out how they would do this. So this is a building in London where they negotiated through the summer of 1945 around a four-sided table. And during that summer, this is the Potsdam Conference, where the successors to the real big three, poor Stalin looking at these other guys must have been like, what happened to Churchill, what happened to Roosevelt? I knew some giants in my day. But the Potsdam Declaration backs up the Allied plan that we will do it. And so in August, that's Jackson in the center, signs the London Agreement creating the world's first international criminal court, the International Military Tribunal. And this is a document he gets in the same month. It's hard to read, but it was a document from a member of his staff in the War Department, Murray Bernays, to a prosecutor on his staff, subject Adolf Eichmann, 15 August 1945. And it's sending along War Department information telling us that this man was the head of the Jewish section of the Gestapo and had primary responsibility for the extermination and the transportation of the Jews. So this vacuuming of information and this getting smart, and frankly this looking for people to capture who are prospective defendants, has that name and has that title and that responsibility, but of course does not have that person who is a fugitive. This is him in his uniformed glory during the war years. They go to Nuremberg, which is that courthouse in the front and the wheel and spoke prison complex. And in this annex building with the 4 big windows on the 3rd floor, we would call it courtroom 600, they prepare a trial which begins in November of 1945. Defendants on the right, their attorneys in front of them, across from them the judge's bench, and then prosecutors' tables and public seating. 4 principal judges from each of the 4 nations plus 4 alternates, functioning as a bench of 8. And this trial begins in November of 1945 and continues through the end of September. Judgment Day is September 30 and October 1, 1946. These are the defendants. Hermann Goering in the lower left, Rudolf Hess, Joachim von Ribbentrop, General Keitel, etc. Albert Speer, you see in the back of the 2nd row, and Fritz Sauckel, who I want to mention particularly, is the man on the far right with the bald dome and the little mustache. It becomes important because he's represented by a lawyer named Robert Servatius, who later becomes the defense counsel to Adolf Eichmann. This is Jackson at the prosecutor's table, and this is Jackson at the podium. His opening statement is regarded as one of the most eloquent, powerful, effective courtroom addresses in history, and I think you can take away the courtroom stuff and just call it a brilliant exposition of what the Third Reich was. And then they try this case. With a holiday break, and I wanted to show you this, it's hard to read, but it says Gethsemane. Robert Jackson visits Palestine when the trial is in its recess during December of 1945. He's a guest of the British High Commissioner. He goes to Jerusalem. So, looking for Eichmann and going to Jerusalem, I don't want to overplay it. And he is strikingly more on vacation than assessing a future homeland for the Jewish people when he's in Jerusalem at that moment. This is Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, who you're going to hear a little bit more about in a bit, who is captured. He also was a fugitive, brought to Nuremberg as a witness and testifies in April of 1946. And he testifies about how he did his job as the commandant of Auschwitz. He pads his numbers, Holocaust historians now know, and says he supervised the extermination of over 2 million Jews. Not quite that huge a number, actually, but well over 1 million. And of course, he reported to Adolf Eichmann, who reported to Himmler, who was at the right hand of Hitler. Jackson had a staff of very talented people, and the man next to him is Telford Taylor, who was one of his principal deputies, who remained on in Nuremberg and was the U.S. chief prosecutor for 12 subsequent American trials. The international trial was one and only, and the alliance fractured. The Cold War really began in a bunch of places, but it began during that year and in that courtroom 600. And so Taylor and his staff conduct 12 subsequent trials. This man is on the Jackson staff and becomes a senior prosecutor on the Taylor staff, Robert Kempner. This is the ministry's case, which is the last of the 12 subsequent trials, and he ends up in Jerusalem as an important assistant and consultant to the prosecution of Adolf Eichmann. This is Benjamin Ferencz, the last of the living Nuremberg prosecutors, who prosecuted the Einsatzgruppe, and is a hero for humanity, and you may have seen him earlier this year on 60 Minutes. This is the Nuremberg published book cover, and I emphasize the record because I want you to understand the fork in the road. The fury and justified vengeance that the world felt in 1945 would have completely justified an understandable finishing off of these Nazis. Whomever the arch criminals are, line them up and mow them down. But the choice to do Nuremberg was a choice to provide proof to judges in court on paper with defense attorneys, a burden of proof, a fair trial. And it produced a record which made possible what happened later. By the end of the Nuremberg process, we're still in the 1940s. Israel is just born. The Federal Republic of Germany is just born. Adolf Eichmann is gone. He's a fugitive. He's perhaps never to be heard from again. And many people who were arch perpetrators were not in that less than 300 defendants who got prosecuted in Nuremberg. This is a book cover, and the last slide I want to show you. Jacob Robinson, who first gets Robert Jackson's totally shocked attention in June of 1945, is a lawyer and an important assistant to the Jackson process and an important assistant to the Eichmann trial process. And in the end, the author of this book, which I would say, apologies to Hannah Arendt or not, is the definitive book about the Eichmann case.